Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Alona Kikbush, the founder and chair of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this book launch, the book launch of our guide to global health diplomacy. Many of you will already have looked at it on the website. It's freely available. We hope that many people will use it. And you see as the subtitle of this book, the three words health, so that health needs to move to the center of negotiations, solidarity, and equity. Those truly are the goals of global health diplomacy. I want to just use 1 minute to introduce the authors of this book, and you see their picture on the next slide. Haik Nikogosian, Michel Kajatskin, who is also speaking today, and Mihaly Kökeni. And it's an extraordinary group of people with, if you look at their bios, very long experience in global health diplomacy as health ministers, heads of organizations, chairs of the executive board, etc. So it was a tremendous privilege to work with them, and I want to give them a big thank you. But also already now a thank you to the 30 contributors who also helped us in reviewing the guide, in ensuring that it was correct, in providing boxes, case studies, etc. So if any of you are here, a very big thank you to all of you. You have seen how we have structured the program. And we will have first this opening session, then an opening, a set of opening remarks from distinguished leaders, and then we move on to two panels. And I'm absolutely delighted that the WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, is here with us, that he's made the time in this incredibly busy and challenging second year of the pandemic. And of course, for us, it has been important that this guide has been also supported by the WHO. Dr. Tedros also wrote a preface. We were very honored. And the guide does have a focus also on many of the negotiations that happen in the context of the World Health Organization, which are now challenged by being virtual rather than in person. So Dr. Tedros, it's my great pleasure to welcome you and to give you the floor. We need to, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, my sister Ilona. Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm actually, I had a choice, two options, pre-recorded message or in-person virtual. I prefer to be in person to meet my colleagues, and at least, if not in person, I'm in virtual live. So thank you so much. It's an honor actually to join you. If we have learned anything this past year, it's that none of us can go it alone. We can only thrive when we work together across institutions and across borders. That's why it's truly a pleasure to join you for the launch of the Guide to Global Health Diplomacy. Preparing for the future means learning from the past. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the vital importance of global solidarity to confront shared public health threats. It also shows why we need strengthened multilateralism and top-quality diplomacy. Conversely, the pandemic has also shown that when suspicion and recriminations replace solidarity and diplomacy, the virus can gain a foothold and people suffer. Health, as you know, is a political choice that can and must transcend geopolitics. It's one area where nations can work together across ideological divides to find common solutions to common problems like this one, an invisible COVID and dangerous enemy and a common enemy. And that's why this book and the work of the Graduate Institute are so important to build the health diplomacy capacity of both diplomats and health experts. Modern health diplomacy actually started in 1839, when the Sultan of Constantinople declared a quarantine throughout the Ottoman Empire to combat the plague. When European powers disagreed with these measures being applied to their ships, health diplomacy negotiations were needed. This led to the creation of the Superior Health Council of Constantinople, and 4 years later, the Egyptian Quarantine Board in Alexandria. These are the precursors of the WHO's Eastern Mediterranean Office. Perhaps the most outstanding example was when the Soviet Union and the USA worked together at the height of the Cold War to eradicate smallpox, which had killed, as you know, an estimated 300 million people during the 20th century. When we work in solidarity in a multilateral approach, we can achieve miracles. In 2015, the world came together to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Finance for Development, which I had the honor to chair. It was a moment of great convergence. The nations of the world uniting for a common purpose and a common future. Since then, the creeping tides of misguided nationalism and isolationism have eroded that sense of common purpose. Geopolitical tensions have sometimes overshadowed health diplomatic efforts to stand together. Short-term thinking is the undoing of international cooperation. An approach that considers enlightened self-interest allows for long-term planning and coherent international efforts. We need to reimagine leadership built on mutual trust and mutual accountability to end the pandemic and address the fundamental inequalities that lie at the root of so many of the world's problems. Solidarity and equity will keep us all safer. The Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator is health diplomacy in action, an unprecedented collaboration between countries, international agencies, the private sector, and other partners to ensure vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics are shared equitably as global public goods. Vaccine equity is a litmus test for solidarity and global health diplomacy. Every life that's lost now is all the more tragic as vaccines are beginning to be rolled out. Alongside traditional public health measures, how quickly we can collectively expand vaccine manufacturing and roll out vaccines to all countries will determine how soon we control the pandemic. Going forward, we have to put in place a strengthened multilateral system to be better prepared for the next challenges, from climate change to another pandemic. In my work in the UN family, at summits such as the G20, G7, or with groupings like the African Union, BRICS, the European Union, or ASEAN, and in many daily interactions with political, economic, and societal leaders, I can see that there has never been a greater need for accomplished health diplomacy. For all those reasons, I'm grateful for this guide, which I hope will be a valuable and practical tool to be both professional and effective in their work. Thank you once again, my sister Ilona. Vielen Dank and congratulations.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Tedros. And again, thank you for joining us, but also for this message. And I think we all in health diplomacy have this feeling of urgency. As you said, you know, this is a litmus test for health diplomacy, and a litmus test that will be played out in many different organizations, in the UN, in the WHO, in the World Trade Organization, at all the bodies that you have mentioned, and who are actually discussing this as we speak, and are taking this agenda forward. And it's also good for us to know that WHO is now at the table, and you personally are also at those tables that are negotiating these important decisions. So thank you very much. And we will also take your message with us, the message of the centrality of health, the importance of solidarity, and the notion of equity. And as you know, that's the subtitle also of our guide to health diplomacy. That's the outcomes that we want to see. It is now my great pleasure to share with you the words of Alain Berset. Alain Berset is the Federal Counselor of Home Affairs here in Switzerland. I have mentioned that we have had tremendous support from the Swiss Confederation, various multi-sectoral departments in developing this guide. We have had financial support to take it forward. And I ask the team to now let us hear from Alain Berset, the Federal Counselor. I hope he comes. There will always be a hiccup. Dear team, we cannot hear the counselor.
Distinguished participants, today is the launch of a guide to global health diplomacy published by the Global Health Center. And it is my great pleasure to provide some opening remarks on this occasion. And it is my honor to join other distinguished speakers today, including Dr. Tedros, Director General of WHO, former WHO Director General Margaret Chan, Mr. Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and many others. The value of global health diplomacy has probably never been more apparent as it is today. In this pandemic, the international community needs to come together in solidarity, counting on collaboration and multilateralism. In this crisis, we need skilled diplomacy to find good solutions. Recent groundbreaking multilateral initiatives, including the COVAX facility and the ACT accelerator, have shown what can be achieved through global cooperation. These are milestones in the history of global health. Switzerland has contributed to these initiatives financially, but also by co-chairing a group of friends. Switzerland, my country, is an active member of the international community and actively promotes global health cooperation. We are committed to a strong and effective global health architecture with the WHO at its core. And Switzerland remains committed to build bridges between different actors, public and private, at the international level. Our goal is to facilitate a constructive, targeted dialogue. You know Geneva? Geneva, as the global health capital, provides a unique ecosystem for global health diplomacy, with a very high concentration of global health institutions, as well as a nearly universal representation of diplomatic missions. These health diplomats will find in this publication a very valuable reference work. The publication of this guide is very timely. It provides a compass to navigate through the worlds of global health diplomacy. And Switzerland is delighted to have supported the development of this reference work together with WHO. I would like to thank Prof. Ilona Kickbusch, Bing Kim Nguyen, Shuri Moon, and the team at the Global Health Center, one of the key knowledge hubs in Geneva. My congratulations for the launch of the Guide to Global Health Diplomacy. And I'm strongly convinced that it will prove invaluable to the international health community. Thank you very much.
So we say a big thank you to Councillor Berset and of course such a strong supporter to global health diplomacy, to the Global Health Center for many years, and of course also to the World Health Organization. So we now move on to our high-level statements. We have an extraordinary group of people who wanted to express their general support to global health diplomacy and also share some of their thoughts on how it is developing. And the first high-level statement that we will have is from Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and also the Vice President of the European Commission. And many of you who are involved in global health diplomacy will know that over the last years, the European Union and the European Commission have become ever more active participants in global health diplomacy, particularly in Geneva and at the World Health Organization. So it's my great pleasure to ask the team to let us listen to Josep Borrell.
Dear colleagues, dear participants, thank you. Thank you to the Global Health Center and Ilona Kickbusch for organizing this timely event on global health diplomacy. Health has taken center stage and has been at the core of all public decisions in the last year. The world experts, scientists, policymakers, and diplomats are focusing urgently on a single issue. Never before have we needed health diplomacy as we do now. And that's why this event is timely, and I welcome it. We can only overcome the challenges if we all join forces. As we often say, no country will be safe and the global economy will not recover until the virus is under control on all continents. This principle has been at the center of the European response to the pandemic from the beginning. And COVID-19 has reinforced the realization that we need multilateral cooperation and effective multilateral system. From the start of the pandemic, the European Union has supported the coordination role of the United Nations system and the World Health Organization in particular. The EU is leading international negotiations to strengthen the WHO and to support rapid reinforcement of the global health system. We also need to address the fact that not all countries have the same capacity to face the pandemic. We must avoid any form of vaccine nationalism, where only the richest countries would be able to vaccinate their populations soon. We also need to avoid vaccine diplomacy, linking access to vaccines to political dependency. Europe has invested billions to help to develop COVID-19 vaccines, and the European Union and its member states are the biggest funders of COVAX, with the aim to make vaccines available to all countries without discrimination. We will continue giving COVAX our full support to purchase 2 billion vaccine doses by the end of 2021, including over 1.3 billion for low and lower middle-income countries. COVAX is the result of a strong global collaboration, but it can only be the start, and we will need to mobilize additional support in the months ahead. We very much welcome in this regard the commitment of the new US administration to join COVAX and rejoin the WHO. In addition, as Team Europe, the European Union is working on sharing vaccines with our neighbors and partners around the world and on the necessary production capacity of vaccine doses as agreed with the different pharmaceutical companies. Each of these efforts contribute to the same goal: rapid, equitable, and universal access to safe and effective vaccines. COVID-19 has shown us that global collaboration, solidarity, and sharing of expertise and information should be at the heart of global health diplomacy. This is key to a healthier, more equal, and more sustainable world that benefits each and every one of us. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
So we say thank you very much to Josep Borrell and that strong message from the European Union and the European Commission. And we hope that as we move forward and our panels will partly take up this issue of vaccine equity, that this global solidarity will be lived and will be moved forward. It's now a very, very special pleasure for me to welcome Margaret Chan, the former Director General of the World Health Organization and now the inaugural Dean of the Vanke School of Public Health, Tsinghua University in China. Margaret, as we were developing the Global Health Diplomacy program at the Graduate Institute, was one of our strongest supporters. And I'm delighted that she has agreed to say a few words now. Please, let's listen to her.
Dr. Tedros, Director General of the World Health Organization, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good day to all of you. Greetings from Hong Kong. And as the founding dean of Vanke School of Public Health in Tsinghua University, I take this opportunity to send you my warmest congratulations. Congratulations to the Global Health Center in Geneva for launching a guide on global health diplomacy, which is so important for the world. It comes as no surprise to all of us. Health has become center stage. Health is so dominant in the evolving diplomatic world. Without diplomacy, we cannot begin to negotiate we cannot begin to agree and we cannot begin to come together in endorsing all the important policy decisions that impact the health and well-being of the world's population. Global health policy can be a bridge for international cooperation for tackling public health crises, strengthening health systems through emphasizing universal health coverage, for sustainable and equitable development, and rebuilding multilateral organizations. Diplomacy in health holds great promise. As the founding dean of the new Venki School of Public Health in Tsinghua University, and with the strong support of Tsinghua leadership, our team has started a short-term training program on global health diplomacy for capacity building to those working in international health organizations, diplomatic missions, and health officials. We are very excited to collaborate with the Global Health Center in Geneva and to have the guide translated, published, and launched in China in the very near future. Thank you for this opportunity. And once again, many congratulations for this wonderful guide.
A big thank you to Margaret, and of course also the very special thank you for announcing that there will be a Chinese translation of the guide. I think I can also announce that Fiocruz in Brazil, and the director of Fiocruz is with us on a later panel, has already began, Nisia, to translate the guide. I think it's nearly finished, except trying to put in, the changes we have made last minute. So a big thank you for that. And we, of course, hope that other languages will follow, because it is so important to be able to understand in one's own language, and then hopefully also be able to use it for teaching and training. Those of you that are familiar with global health diplomacy will know that one of the really important initiatives around this started in I think around 2007 in initiating a health and foreign policy group, to which also a number of the countries that are represented today was launched. And the then foreign minister of Norway, Jonas Gahr Støre, was the initiator that brought the initial 7 countries together that have been working until today and continue to influence the UN General Assembly agenda and put health on this agenda every single year with a great focus. And of course, again, Brazil is one of those countries. France, that's also joining us later, is one of those countries. So this is an exciting initiative, and I welcome very much that Jonas Gahr Støre has agreed to say a few words to us. Please, team, let us listen to Jonas.
It's a true pleasure to salute the launch of a guide to global health diplomacy. When I became foreign minister in 2005, I decided to address a few of my colleagues in the foreign ministry environment to seek agreement on an alliance among foreign ministers to address the link between foreign policy and health. And this came from my background at the WHO with Dr. Brundtland, where we saw how foreign policy in so many ways was influenced by how public health developed in a country, in a region, and globally. We knew around the year 2000 that this century will be a century of potential pandemics. We live in the midst of one, and we wanted to strengthen the toolbox of foreign ministers to analyze the world, analyze relations, analyze ways of addressing differences of interest, commonality of interests with a public health lens, so to say, looking at the world through the lens of public health. So in 2007, we launched the Oslo Declaration, addressing some of these links. And I really am encouraged to see the big steps forward taken by these 4 eminent public health persons who have launched this guide. It's a rich volume with practical insights, a lot of background information, and a lot of sound wisdom on how to analyze and understand public health and the critical need for better global health diplomacy. So good luck with the launch, good luck with the spread, and I will do everything I can in my political work in Norway and beyond to forward the ideas in this very important guide. And I look forward to reading it beyond looking at the PDF file, because I think it's a very valuable piece of work. Thank you for your attention.
So a big thank you to Jonas Støre, one of the people who really got this global health diplomacy movement started and continuing to support it very strongly throughout the years, and of course continuing to be politically very active in his own country in moving such agendas forward. We come now to the last contribution in this opening session, and I'm delighted that Julian Braithwaite, the ambassador and permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, has agreed to address us. You know that global health diplomacy has taken quite a center stage in the present G7 negotiations. In the meetings, actually, there is a meeting tomorrow on vaccine equity as well at the G7. So we are delighted that Julian Braithwaite agreed to address us. Please, team, let us listen to the ambassador.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the United Kingdom on the occasion of the launch of the Global Health Diplomacy Guide. As you're probably aware, the UK currently has the presidency of the G7. We're using this important forum to drive global health diplomacy, which is needed now more than ever in these challenging times. The COVID-19 outbreak is the biggest global health emergency in a generation. It has yet again demonstrated what you all know, that disease outbreaks do not respect borders, and that we must invest in global health consistently, not just when a pandemic strikes. We need a fully coordinated international response to mitigate the global impact of the outbreak and strengthen our preparedness against future global health threats, including pandemics. The UK is at the forefront of the international effort to tackle COVID-19, including raising $2.4 billion for the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment. COVAX and the ACT Accelerator are the world's best mechanisms to support equitable access to vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics. We must not squander this opportunity. Our presidency of the G7 will build on this collective work. This is a crucial forum. Between the G7 and guest countries, the 10 leaders represent 2.2 billion people and over half the world's economy. We'll work with G7 member states and other partners to drive the following G7 priorities. First, we must promote global health security for everyone, recognizing this impacts services, economic prosperity, our collective security, and much more. Within this, we must better prevent, detect and respond to outbreaks and build momentum for change, including on WHO reform. Second, international leadership is needed on vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics, including strengthening coordination around clinical trials to improve their creation and delivery around the world. Third, it is important that wider health risks are not neglected in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We therefore want to see the G7 working towards new commitments on antimicrobial resistance, a silent and slow motion pandemic, and one of the top 10 global public health threats facing humanity. Finally, the G7 should be at the forefront of harnessing the latest technology and data across these challenges, and we therefore see digital health as an important pillar. This is an ambitious G7 global health agenda which requires international action to build back better for our people globally. As the pandemic has demonstrated, no one is safe until everyone is safe, and the health of every country depends on the whole world. Congratulations to the Global Health Centre on your launch today. I, along with my colleagues in the British government, will be reading your guide to global health diplomacy with great interest as we pursue our own G7 global health diplomacy.
So a big thank you to the ambassador, and of course, as many of you know, India has been invited to join the deliberations of the G7, and I'm sure we will hear more about that and India's role also in vaccine diplomacy as these equity issues are moving forward as big challenges. So we move straight away to our two panels, and I'm delighted that Tom Boyke from the Global Health Program at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. has joined us to moderate the first panel, which we have entitled 2020, the Year of COVID-19 Diplomacy. And Tom, without further ado, I hand over to you. You will introduce the speakers and the panelists, and I very much look forward to the discussions. Please, Tom.
Thank you so much. So to craft health policy, governments, international institutions, and non-governmental organizations must find a way to manage the health risks that spill into and out of every country. These endeavors constitute the realm of global health diplomacy. And this terrific book that Ilona and her co-authors have produced helps us better understand the concepts, the mechanisms, the actors, and the history of global health diplomacy, and points us in the direction of the many ways it must evolve to address our present and future global health challenges. So many of the greatest challenges in global health are collective action problems, whether it is responding to the current pandemic or preparing for the inevitability of future pandemic threats, responding to chronic diseases that still represent the largest killer of people under 60 worldwide, and the lifestyle factors that contribute to their increase globally, to pollution and climate change, which still rank low on the global health agenda, despite daily evidence in your country and mine of its devastating health effects. In short, global health diplomats are going to be busy in the future, and they're going to be busy at a moment where multilateralism is at a point of crisis, and we are in the midst of geopolitical and economic shifts in power. I congratulate the authors on this great text, particularly producing it, especially amid all else that they're doing in this pandemic. So it really is quite an accomplishment. And I'm thrilled to have started reading it and finishing it. And I commend it to all of you to do the same. I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this excellent session on the year in COVID-19 diplomacy, small topic. Our panel will begin with opening remarks from Michel Kazakhin. He is well suited to give those remarks because first and foremost, he is a co-author of this new book, so is well placed to draw the lessons from that. He is a member of the independent panel of pandemic preparedness and response. And as many of you will know, from 2007 to 2012 was executive director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And from 2012 to 2017, served as the UN General Secretary's Special Envoy on HIV/AIDS. So with that, I will turn it over to Michel. Do we have you?
Yep.
Great.
Sorry, can you?
We can hear you perfectly now.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone online. 2020 has unquestionably been dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that for health diplomats, no doubt, 2020 has been the year of COVID-19 diplomacy. And across almost all of the areas or sub-areas of health diplomacy that we review in our book, be it global health architecture and governance, the role of WHO, the necessary multi-sectorality in addressing health issues, the sharing of science, access to essential supplies and common goods, vaccine diplomacy, humanitarian diplomacy. The health and well-being of hundreds of millions of people across the globe have been abruptly threatened, and more than half of the world's population forced into confinement. Our economies and the very structure of our societies have been shaken, and multilateralism has been challenged. And the crisis has yet not finished unwinding its negative impact. The world has realized how much, among all global issues, it is health that in the short term has the greatest potential of disruption in our globalized world. I found it encouraging in this context to see a near consensus forging on the importance of science as a basis of health policies, and on the priority given to the safety of people over economic and other considerations, even at high costs. As in previous pandemics, to say that the virus can affect us all did not mean, however, that it affected us all equally. Stark inequalities have been revealed within and between countries. We have seen countries competing for resources, whether for masks or diagnostics, and today for vaccines. It isn't difficult to guess who will emerge as a winner in such a competition in the absence of global regulation, global governance, and of common resources for common goods, the very heart and the very objective of global health diplomacy. The crisis has revealed many flaws in global preparedness and response. The international system we have established for health security did not really work as a system. There were clear gaps in preparedness, management of the response, coordination, or else interoperability between global, regional, and country levels. Effective vaccines are now available, but there's manifest inequity in vaccine rollout. The race for vaccines has exacerbated competition, fueled vaccine nationalism, when the world needs universality and equity in access to vaccines to ultimately come out of the crisis. The system did not perform as the timely, equitable, inclusive, coordinated, cross-sectoral, transparent, and accountable system than one would wish to see manage preparedness, alert, and response. A system of which the governance has been suboptimal at all levels. As just one illustration, it remains difficult to understand why it took until October 2020 for the executive board, the governing body of WHO, to meet at a time when over 35 million people had already been infected globally. A system and its governance that have constantly been challenged to function in tense and difficult geopolitical and economic realities of the moment. COVID-19 emerged at a high point of geopolitical tension and in times of weakened multilateralism, as already said by previous speakers. And that has forcibly impacted on the response to the pandemic, whether it is at global level in, for example, preventing the Security Council from agreeing on a resolution last March, in contrast to the unanimous agreement of the Council in response to HIV or Ebola, or in many instances at country level in shaping policies and thus driving epidemic patterns and trajectories. In addition, in the last few months, as I just mentioned, geopolitics have been enriched, quote, enriched with the vaccine as a new matter for international debate and a new instrument of power. All of these issues are at the center of global health diplomacy. and have been continuously addressed throughout the year in capitals, at regional level, and at global level here in Geneva and in New York. Thus, the question for us today, as I'm sure will now be discussed by our distinguished panelists, is not whether 2020 has been the year of global health diplomacy, but what has global health diplomacy achieved during the crisis, and where has it failed? And looking forward, which are the challenges global health diplomacy is facing in the new political and economic environment of 2021, as we draw the lessons from the crisis and as we work together to make the world more prepared, more secure, more equitable, and more resilient to the global health challenges of the future. Thank you.
Thank you for those terrific remarks. They set the stage beautifully for what's about to come. As I mentioned, we have a very rich topic to explore on this panel, the year of COVID-19 diplomacy, and not much time to discuss it. We're going to have 5 minutes of opening remarks from each of the panelists on the main lessons that they draw from how health diplomacy has been conducted in the COVID-19 crisis, rivalries, scientific uncertainty, and nationalism. They're each going to focus on a different angle, taking the issue from where they sit. Because we have limited time, I'm going to introduce each of them really just by their title. I'm grossly truncating their spectacular achievements, so I do suggest to you that you look at the biographies we have online, but I will run through them in the order that they are planning to speak. So Dr. Jawad Majzour is the Assistant Director General of the Emergency Preparedness Division within the World Health Organization's Emergency Program. He will go first, speaking from the WHO perspective. Trudy Makaya is the economic advisor rather, to President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, and will speak to the geoeconomic interface with global health and its response in this crisis. Shani Haider, India's diplomatic editor at the Hindu paper in Delhi, will look at India's diplomatic approach to this crisis, including with regard to vaccines. And last, my friend and the co-director of the Global Health Center, Suri Moon, will speak about what we learned from Ebola and how the response to COVID-19 has been shaped by those lessons. And with that, Dr. Majzour, I'd invite you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you for this kind invitation. Esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honored to be with you today among this distinguished panel of experts to discuss on how health diplomacy has been conducted in the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, as you know, the devastating impact of the COVID pandemic on society's economics and health is unprecedented, and exploiting inequities within and between countries also was one of the consequences of this pandemic. And its impact, like Professor Kazakshkin said, will continue for years to come, unfortunately. We noticed that during this crisis, no country was prepared for health emergency of the extent of the COVID, including countries with mature health systems. This pandemic also show us, again, if needed, that the country's preparedness is the cornerstone of the global preparedness, and also that the pandemic preparedness and response is a global public health good that all of us we need to maintain and keep functional. COVID also has revealed that and has deepened inequities, unfortunately, within and between countries and communities, and we saw it in several settings, like Professor Kazakshin reminded us during the first phases with the PPEs, after that the diagnostic, and now with the vaccine. The current inequities and access to vaccine, medicine, and diagnosis are morally, of course, undefensible, threatening to prolong the pandemic, leading to many more preventable deaths and contributing to even greater social and economic disruption. The priorities of health diplomacy, at least in our opinion, is to bring all countries together to find the area of common interest, common operational overlap on development issues and resource allocation for this global fight against COVID. The pandemic has demonstrated the increasing importance of multilateralism and the importance of health diplomacy, and also the international organization, the role of the international organization as source of technical expertise, providing scientific basis for government and state to legitimize their decision and action. Let me take 2 minutes to share with you some example of global health diplomacy in action, at least from the WHO perspective. As a technical organization with convening power and access to the world health leading expert networks and collaborating centers and collaborative research institution and innovation platform, such the research and development blueprint for research in epidemic, WHO worked with partners to generate high quality evidence and leverage a broad range of global expertise to rapidly issue authoritative, accessible guidance for all technical and operational area of the response. The global COVID-19 outbreak led also to an acute shortage of essential supply and led also to stopping export and essential supply by some countries. WHO worked closely with partners, agencies in the supply chain task force to provide access to personal protective equipment, biomedical equipment, and diagnostic supply to countries that need them in a timely manner. Uh, Also through the research and development blueprint, over 130 scientists, funders, and manufacturers from across the world committed to working with WHO to speed development of vaccine against COVID. Through this monumental global effort, the world now has a set of vaccine diagnosis and therapy that can help, of course, the world to fight this virus and to keep it under control. Through the global health diplomacy, WHO brought the world together to provide direct technical and operation support to countries to implement national COVID plans under the umbrella of solidarity. But despite this positive initiative, we must not lose sight of the challenge of inequities that we are facing. Around 80% of countries now rolling out vaccines are either high income or upper middle income countries. 80% of the developed doses of vaccine have been in only 10 countries. We must continue to work together and use the health diplomacy to ensure that the introduction of new vaccine does not deepen inequalities. Now more than ever is the time to ensure that we utilize the global health diplomacy to cooperate across borders and the region to prioritize vaccination for those most at risk, the vulnerables, and the marginalized population who are very often forgotten. Vaccine equities must be our top priorities, not only across countries, but also within communities and societies. Our hope and aim is by the World Health Day on 7 April this year, COVID-19 vaccine are being administered in every country, a symbol of hope for overcoming both the pandemic and the inequalities that lie at the root of so many global health challenges. Let me conclude by saying first that the COVID-19 pandemic is a stark reminder that the cost of effective preparedness are a small proportion of the cost of failure to prepare. Second, the world now has an opportunity to build on progress made in 2020 and move toward a sustainable future of emergency preparedness and readiness. Third, the world will emerge from this pandemic with the new normal in global health, where we will need a higher political commitment to ensure interconnected global system to prevent, predict, respond to, and recover from health emergencies to safeguard population and community all over the world from future pandemic. And last but not least, to bring this high political commitment to reality, we must be guided by spirit of solidarity, fairness, transparency, and equity. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much for those thoughtful remarks. Next, we'll hear from Trudy Makaya. Trudy.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, esteemed guests. Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. I think I've been asked to look at the economic angle to efforts since the pandemic and up to now. One thing that became very clear early on, including in our work with the G20, was that there were very clear common key priorities that emerged on the global agenda in terms of the economic response. So there was a clear message that there should be no resources that are spared in terms of saving lives and spending money on the healthcare response. Financial resources should not be a constraint for any country to be able to deal with the pandemic. There was a global call, very much reinforced by heads of state at the G20 for significant fiscal and monetary stimulus measures, and also with developing countries to be supported by multilateral organizations. And we've seen organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, regional multilaterals swiftly preparing instruments, various kinds of instruments to support emergency financing for accessing tools to deal with the pandemic, and also fiscal support for the fallout, the economic fallout from the pandemic. Then there was the call for debt relief that particularly from the African Union and many other developing countries was made, which was then crystallized in the debt service suspension initiative, with also encouragement by other private and other creditors should also offer debt suspension on similar terms as the DSSI. There was clear support from the G20 for ACTA and all other collaborative efforts to fund and equitably distribute vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. However, in practice, we already see the challenges. For instance, with vaccine equity being a very pressing matter now, we're seeing that we might face a situation where the most potent variants are emerging in certain parts of the world, and vaccination is happening in quite another part of the world where there isn't that risk. And so, we're seeing the challenges in terms of where we got to, the progress that we did make. There are some important ideas that were on the table in terms of the economic response that didn't make it or haven't found expression yet. So if we look at fiscal response, there's a great inequality where advanced economies have put packages all the way to 20% of GDP in terms of their fiscal measures, and developing countries are in the low digits in terms of their fiscal support. And so there have been significant calls that there should be resources at global level that are injected. A key example being special drawing rights at the IMF. That was an idea that had a long life. Last year, we're still talking about it. It hasn't found much expression, even though there is hope that in this year we might be able to get something going, to allocate special drawing rights, and also to think carefully about redistribution of those special drawing rights according to countries' needs. There was the question of arrangements between central banks. I won't go deep into the thickets of that in terms of swap arrangements where countries are facing liquidity challenges to access hard currency. That idea simply did not take off. We have a situation where amongst advanced countries, central banks, there's cooperation, but none has been extended to many other developing countries. The stance of the credit ratings agencies also in their assessment of countries that take up debt relief is also uncertain. So some countries have been reluctant to take advantage of measures in the global multilateral financial institutions because of fear of how that might be expressed in credit ratings agencies' assessments, and we haven't really been able to get a clear sense of how that is to be resolved. At the WTO, of course, South Africa, India, and a few other countries have also been calling for a waiver to TRIPS for IP related to COVID-19 management tools. That is still in process. I think a lot is going to happen in the next few weeks in terms of resolving that issue. There are promising signs, but it hasn't been, an easy negotiation up to now. But I think there is an appreciation that there's got to be technology transfer, there's got to be local manufacturing, and that current other alternative arrangements to do that, in absence of a TRIPS waiver, are going to be very difficult. In terms of our own regional dynamics, the African Union, I think under the chairship of President Ramaphosa, there were various initiatives that really brought the continent together. So there was the Africa COVID-19 Response Fund that was seeded with initial money by African governments, but also open to contributions from donors to support both the fiscal response, but also just the emergency response in dealing with access to tools to manage COVID-19. There's the Africa Medical Supplies Platform, which allows bargaining and procurement of tools and vaccines at continental level. There's also the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Task Force that works alongside that, led by special envoys that were appointed by the chair of the union, like Tijan Tiam, Strive Masiyiwa, Donald Kaberuka. So we're also seeing quite historic cooperation between our private sector coming to the party to support our efforts to deal with the pandemic, and also helping with some of the negotiations that we've had to have with financial institutions. We've also seen key regional institutions like the Africa CDC, the Afrexim Bank, really coming into their own in leading the continent in a coordinated approach. So Tom, if I had to give an overall assessment of our efforts, I would say, institutions like the G20 and our regional organizations really had to navigate a difficult environment in terms of a pandemic. Some of the basics and the basic principles are in place, but certainly more can, should, and has to be done this year in terms of strengthening that coordination and that response, and also getting over some of the hurdles that we faced in the early months when we were dealing with this. And also, I would say that there are many interesting case studies like the African Union, where the pandemic has actually strengthened regional cooperation and has set the basis for many other future initiatives and possibly better preparedness going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for those great remarks. I really appreciate that. So Hasini Haider, you are next.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at such an important occasion. And I have had the privilege of going through the guidebook somewhat. And I think it is a very, very invaluable manual, really, going forward, because these are going to become catchwords of the future when it comes to global health diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, and all the rest. Here in India, we have been poised at what I could call a significant vantage point, watching when it comes to the COVID pandemic, particularly from 4 different angles. To begin with, in terms of the number of cases, given India's population, India has had the second highest number of cases. It has had the fourth highest number of deaths. That's simply because of the fact that it has such a large population. But I would also like to add that it is one of the countries that has had the strictest of lockdowns quite early in the pandemic. So for all those reasons, India's experience has been fairly unique. The second part of India's experience was driven out of the lockdown by the position of its diaspora. India has one of the largest diasporas around the world, particularly in the Gulf, where we have 6 million Indians working and living over there in Gulf and those areas. And many of them were stuck. Many of them were not able to come home. Work had stopped worldwide. As someone said, essentially, they were isolated inside and kept inside. And one of the big challenges India had to face was bringing them back. Remember also, there is a challenge going forward for that, because a World Bank study has found that about 25% of the remittances sent in by migrant labor and other workers in South Asia are going to be cut by a quarter. So that's a future challenge that has to be faced, particularly in this region. But it wasn't all bad news. As I said, on the one hand, here was India's statistic as far as the number of deaths, the number of cases was concerned. But when it came to cases per million, India actually came far down in the charts to about 120th, so from those positions. There is also now evidence, and it is quite clear that even though the first case of coronavirus came to the southern shores of India fairly early at the end of January 2020, it was a slow progression. In fact, across South Asia, we have seen that COVID has been actually a much slower progression than in many parts of Europe and the US that we were looking at. Some have even suggested now special studies for South Asia, perhaps for other countries of the global South. Some have suggested there are natural immunities or immunities from the kind of vaccines already widespread over here. The fourth point of uniqueness has essentially been India's position as the pharmacy of the world. That's something that it is aiming to do. And essentially the idea that it is not only working as the pharmacy of the world, but also the vaccine capital of the world. So right from the very beginning, even while protocols for the COVID pandemic were being worked out, Indian companies, they were in demand for the production of hydroxychloroquine. India actually did the reverse of what many countries had done. When we talk about vaccine nationalism and health nationalism, India actually reversed an export ban on HCQ in order to provide them to dozens of countries around the world, along with other medicines that were being used, antiviral, aspirin, and all the rest of that. In addition, India actually produces about 2/3, about 65% of the WHO requirements worldwide for vaccines like DPT, BCG, and the measles. Those strengths have now been used for production of the Covishield vaccine that was developed by AstraZeneca and Oxford University. So far, as of last week, India had already exported about 23 million doses of the vaccine. Again, this comes in stark contrast to all the talk about vaccine nationalism. About 16.5 million of those were actually commercial exports. The rest were grants to neighboring countries, Caribbean and the Gulf. In fact, we are told by the Ministry of External Affairs that in the coming weeks, vaccines will be supplied to more countries in Africa, Latin America, CARICOM, Pacific Island states as well. This is something, interestingly, Indians have taken great pride on. There is the irony that India has been at the forefront of producing these vaccines and not of consuming them, however. And that's something we're going to see very shortly. In the last month of inoculations, India has vaccinated about 8.4 million people. Doses have been given. But that really puts India, in terms of per capita inoculations quite low in the list, about 18th, even though it is in terms of numbers about 4th in the global charts. Now, one of the reasons is that India has still restricted its vaccine inoculations to healthcare workers, frontline workers. It is not available, interestingly, commercially inside the country, even though, as I said, so much of the vaccines are being sent for commercial exports. I want to take just one quick minute to talk about what we are going to see going forward, because these are themes we do discuss here in India quite a lot at the national level, of course. Whether or not this pandemic is going to force a change in priorities, whether it comes to moving the focus away from things like defense budgets and infrastructure budgets to things like health security, food security, job security, particularly in the developing world, these are going to be important. At the multilateral level, and I'm so glad that your guidebook spoke about some of the WTO strictures, it's not just vaccine nationalism. There has been this idea around the world that health patents have to be held very closely. India went through quite a lot of, faced a lot of flack and penalties over its production and export of HIV drugs, particularly to Africa. These are themes that need to be rethought by the world. And finally, at a global level, we do need to think, and I'm not sure this is, we're going to be able to take it very much forward in this conversation, but we think the position of the United Nations, there's a sense now that this has become an outdated and unrepresentative body. We have come through what is hopefully the worst of the coronavirus, but global leadership has not come through it. It did not come through for the world in detecting the virus, in controlling its spread, nor has it, by example, seen global leaders coming out on top when it comes to treating the virus. So there must be some kind of rethink when it comes to which way we are going to go forward. These were just some of the themes I wanted to put forward from the Indian perspective. I'm happy to take any questions later.
Great, thank you so much. Very thought-provoking and comprehensive remarks. So thank you for that. Suri?
Thanks, Tom. First, it's a real honor and pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to add my congratulations to the team of authors for this really excellent resource. I think that there's really just one message that I want to offer, which is that we cannot protect health without global health diplomacy. We need much more from our global health diplomats, and in fact, your work is just beginning. And I was thinking about, who might be joining us for this conversation, and I think as many of you are global health diplomats, and I think one thing that the book makes quite clear is that you don't need to be a health specialist and you don't need to be a formal diplomat. And in fact, some of the most important global health diplomats are economic advisors, or are coming from media, or are coming from civil society and academia and foundations, and not necessarily from the traditional ranks of diplomacy. And I think if there's one lesson we've really seen over the past year from COVID, it's that the diplomacy is not only the responsibility of ministries of health, but trade and science and technology, intellectual property, travel, tourism, finance, economy, you can go down the list, that every single one of these ministries in government needs to be mobilized to negotiate solutions to some of the challenges we've been seeing. I promised to say a few words about, what did we learn about global health diplomacy from I would say the last major global health security crisis, which was the West African Ebola crisis, now about 7 years ago. And I think one of the lessons we learned then was that you need diplomats, you need diplomacy to put in place reforms, right? That you need people who know how to navigate political barriers and to get the politics right, basically to put in place any kind of reforms. But we also know that there's really only bandwidth to do a limited number of things. And we know that there were only a few reforms that were needed that were actually implemented after that crisis. And so what does that tell us? When we start looking at the future, I think it means it reminds us that the work of diplomats is really just beginning, that there's a huge agenda ahead of us. And the big challenge post-Ebola was not knowledge. The big challenge was not, do we know what needs to be done? There were many reviews, there were lots of experts, and largely they agreed. They agreed on the big reform items that were necessary. And again, you know, we have Michelle Kazachkin from the independent panel, one of a number of very, very important review processes that that need to happen, that are happening. But I think at the end of the day, the big challenge will not be what needs to be done, but actually how to do it. And this is the work of diplomats. It's how to implement and how to navigate the politics to actually get change done. One very useful illustration, I think, of this lesson is indeed the vaccine issue, which we have heard about from almost every single speaker today. We knew already, certainly prior to Ebola, I think for many years, but certainly beginning in 2007, when the Indonesian government expressed its profound concern that it would not get access to vaccines during a flu outbreak, an influenza outbreak at the time. We knew that the issue of access to vaccines in a pandemic would be a huge challenge. We knew it again during H1N1, when indeed we saw this exact same kind of vaccine nationalism we've seen today. So we've known this for quite some time, but actually we have very weak, frankly, quite non-existent rules and agreements at the international level to make sure that countries get access to vaccines. So this is not a surprise. This is not something that is new to the global health community, but it's something that we have not yet managed to address. And so when I go back to the challenge that Michelle gave us at the beginning of this panel, what are the big achievements? What has global health diplomacy achieved in 2020? I do think the creation of COVAX, agreement among 190 countries that some degree of sharing and equity is necessary, is a huge achievement. The creation of COVAX out of thin air basically is a huge achievement. But we also know that COVAX expects to reach maybe 3% of the population in COVAX supplied countries over the next few months, and 3% is frankly, we need to aim far, far higher than that. And so I think if there's something that diplomacy certainly has not achieved, and that I hope will achieve in the coming months and years, is much more firm and binding commitments at the international level to address issues like vaccine equity. That's one among many, many issues. We know that it's only one, but at the end of the day, we have to get quite serious. And if we don't get serious about building the rules and the agreements and the binding commitments to actually address the challenges, and this is really the work of diplomats, we won't have learned any of the lessons from the past year. Over.
Great, really wonderful remarks. I want to acknowledge that we're running right now a little bit behind, so we're going to talk a bit more on this panel. I'm going to ask a question of the group, perhaps another, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. I tell you that now so that you can start to prepare your questions. So we've talked a little bit about how, as a group, in different facets, how the system responded to this crisis. What I want to talk about next is how the crisis has reshaped the system. And with that, I want to come on a period that many people thought of as an age of miracles in global health. Donor assistance to health increased fourfold. Over that time period, we've seen the rise of new institutions and tremendous progress in addressing pediatric disease, HIV, malaria, TB, many other challenges. And in faced with a crisis that affected everyone, we've really struggled from a global health diplomacy standpoint, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. We had more than 130 countries impose travel restrictions. We had 80 countries plus the European Union impose export bans on personal protective equipment, ventilators, and essential medical supplies. We are 9 weeks into a rollout of a vaccine that right now, roughly 80% of the doses are being used in 9 countries, at least as of last week. 130 countries, with 2.5 billion people, have no access, have not administered a single dose. What I want to know and hear from the audience, and some of you touched upon this a little bit, is what's the legacy for this, for the system? I mean, we're 14 months in, we have yet to have a global summit on how to address this pandemic. Who has this empowered? What changes will we really see in terms of new actors, whether it's regional approaches, new country governments, new intergovernmental institutions? How has this changed the system? It hasn't just revealed new problems, it's altered the system in terms of how it's responding to health challenges in the past. So I can certainly call on someone, but if somebody is provoked by that and wants to start, I would welcome it. But otherwise, I will just call out. And without seeing anybody frantically waving at me in the video, why don't we start with Jawad, and we'll go down the same line that we did before.
No, thank you very much. This is a very important question, and the whole challenge now that we are all facing, how to go out of this crisis and prepare for the next one and avoid the mistake that we did. And I really appreciate the suggestion of Chueri about binding commitment from member states that on the fact that this will never happen again. Of course, we cannot fully prevent pandemics, but at least we need to prepare for. And many head of state now are raising the idea of global treaty on pandemic preparedness and response. And I think this is one idea that should be discussed, and the health diplomacy can put this at least on the table to discuss how this treaty or this framework, whatever, could help. Today we need to concentrate, at least from my opinion, on three major issues. We need to make sure that our countries are prepared, because if we still have only one country who's not prepared, the world will never be protected. And we need to invest on that. Invest in terms of technical assistance, in terms of technical support, but also in terms of funding. And we need that today. Second, we need to establish global mechanism. Some of them may be binding, like Suris proposed, to bring countries together, not only in access and equity, but also in terms of research and development, in terms of supply chain. And you remember how much we suffered to use to supply and send goods to countries. These are the commitments that the country should make together and create a platform that we consider global good to protect this, and to do it during peacetime, to prepare for the next event. At least this is how I see things in the future. Over.
Michelle raised his hand first, and then I see Siri wanting to go next, so maybe we'll go that way. Michelle.
Thank you, Tom. Well, I fully agree. We need binding commitments. We need a reset of the global ecosystem of health security. But my point is slightly different. I also think we need to find ways to elevate the health risk to the level where the world looks at other risks, let's say the nuclear risk, the chemical arms risks, where binding commitments could be reached, where inspections somehow are allowed, if certainly not necessarily welcome, but accepted. And for some reason, health has not reached that level. And that's one of the tasks we have in the next few months as health diplomats, in addition to, let's say, the cooking, which will be putting together a treaty and considering what needs to be reset in the global system.
Terrific. Suri.
Thank you. I think one of the things that we need is to be a bit more creative and flexible on the way we think about the global system, which is to not only look at big global solutions and big global players like, of course, the World Health Organization, but if we look at what's happened in COVID, including it, but not limited to vaccines. We've seen, for example, Ms. Makaya mentioned the role of the African Union and the African CDC. Ilona mentioned earlier how effective the European Union has been, indeed, in at some point banning exports outside the Union, but liberating trade within the Union. And so if we only look at the solutions as, we need an all or nothing huge global system, I think we're going to close off, in fact, what we've seen happen that has been effective in COVID has been this very complex multipolar ecosystem with lots of different solutions being figured out actually by different actors who are not waiting for the answers to come from on high, from Geneva. As a matter of fact, it doesn't mean we don't need Geneva. I mean, we absolutely, of course, need global frameworks and global agreements. But when we think about how have countries figured out how to solve their problems, it has not always been through massive global agreements. And so I think we have to think creatively about how does the entire ecosystem work, including what needs to truly be global versus where do we see either clubs of like-minded actors or regions able to actually implement and move forward and make change in the system. And how can we think about this as part of a coherent whole rather than seeing the world sort of splinter into competing factions? I think this is a big intellectual challenge and it's a big political challenge.
I fully agree. I think we need to observe what has emerged in response to this and has worked well as prescribing what hasn't or observing what hasn't. Let me go to Trudy. Would you like to go next? And then I'll go to Sassini.
Sure. I mean, I think a quick point I'd like to make on this is that one thing that we've struggled with at a national level, but it's also an issue internationally, is just that link between health equity and economic growth and economic policy. I think 2 or 3 G20 summits back, they started having meetings between health and finance ministers. And I remember it was one of the most, people came out of that feeling that there's quite a huge agenda on universal health coverage, on financing health systems that is still nascent in terms of also getting the finance community fully on board to support that. So I think if there is one thing that the system should also do better is making those linkages between the health policy world and the economic policy world. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Yes, you.
Should I go ahead? Oh, okay.
Please.
Well, I do want to make the simple point that if you look, and I'm sorry I've become on this discussion the person with the world charts on a lot of issues, but if you do look at which countries have fared better, I think the answers are very simple, that it does not mean that the richer the country is, the better it has fared with the COVID pandemic, which means that somewhere there we need to rethink our parameters for success, our parameters for how we stack up countries. Is it year-on-year GDP growth? Or is it something else that is sustaining those countries? Some have suggested that it is about leadership, it is about governance, it is about those who are trusted by their people to follow those, the guidelines when it came to the pandemic, who actually did better. So we do need to now recast, as you said, if you're not just thinking of how the system responded to the pandemic, but how the system now is having to change. I think the first thing that has to change, and of course I come from a region in South Asia that has a country like Bhutan that has spoken about gross national happiness for the longest time. And of course, people have a smile on their face when they talk about these things, but we need to think much more closely about what it actually means to move away from a GDP way of thinking altogether. It is clear that in the short term, I used to say about a year ago, it's no longer a funny joke, that the SDGs that mattered to us were the social distancing goals. But at some point, we are going to have to get back to the real SDGs and really talk about how governments are going to move closer together, especially with what the pandemic has shown us, not just about health and the spread of epidemics, what the pandemic has shown us about the environment and what the lockdowns proved to, I think, the naked eye, that really the environment was the biggest perpetrator on the environment is actually human pollution. And I think that's another point that we must reconsider. The final point I want to make is that we live in a world right now, and I think some of the panelists spoke about global supply chains, the idea that globalization itself has come under some pressure. There is a new suspicion of globalization, the idea that the pandemic spread quicker because of globalization, because of all the travel, because of the global supply chains that made countries dependent on them. And so if you want to move away from globalization, but you don't want to make this about hyper-nationalism, then the answer is going to be to break up the world much more into regions on every issue. Of course, it helps with the pandemic. Of course, it helps with cutting down our carbon footprint as well if we talk much more in terms of regions. The European Union, of course, has done things with the vaccine. India did try to lead a kind of movement in South Asia to bring together a pandemic proposal and to bring together funding. And I think that's something that we have to look at much more closely for the future is regional solutions. And instead of looking at the world as one large area of, of cooperation, perhaps make the building blocks much more about the regions and then come to some kind of global consensus.
Great. Really wonderful discussion. I'm going to have to ask for an intervention from our chair to know whether or not I still have time to take questions from the audience or whether I should move to the next panel.
Yeah.
It sounds like
something in closing the panel, Tom, what stays with you, and then we will move on.
Sounds good. I apologize to the audience that we were running a little bit long, but I can see that we're having quite an active chat discussion. So I'm glad that people are having an opportunity to interact, at least in that format. With me is that, again, we do have our work cut out for us, those of us that work in global health diplomacy, as these speakers really have illustrated. It's not just responding to underappreciated threats. It really is cobbling together a system in which some actors and some institutions have been empowered and some have been weakened, and taking the opportunities where we can to advance health for all and the safety of the most vulnerable. So I'm really grateful for the insights and provocative thoughts of this group and to have had this opportunity to speak to all of you today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ilona.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much to the panelists. You've really put forward some challenging issues. And if I take the three issues that Michelle highlighted, what has global health diplomacy achieved? We've heard some of those points also from Dr. Tedros and Majur. We've heard particularly what was achieved at the regional level, and those of you who will use our guide will see we've given quite a lot of space to regional organizations in recognizing this development. We've heard where we failed, and we've heard, some very stringent examples of failure of the multilateral system. And we have to think very, very seriously about that. And we've already had some indications of looking forward. And that, of course, is the intention of our next panel, to look forward, to look at the future of global health diplomacy. I hope the panelists of the previous panel that we just completed can stay on to see how the points interact. And I'd like to hand over to Gaudens Silberschmidt, who has kindly agreed to chair this, moderate this panel. Gaudens was a very important person when we launched the Global Health Center and global health diplomacy as an area of work. At that point, he was still with the Swiss government and was health ambassador for Switzerland. Now he is the director of health and multilateral partnerships at the WHO. And I hand over to you straight away, Gaudens. We can't hear you, Gaudens. Can somebody help unmute Gaudens, please? He's sitting where Dr. Tedros sat, in case you are looking at. Now we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Ilona. Health diplomacy has to learn from the past to shape the present and the future, and that's where we want to go. As Dr. Tedros mentioned, modern health diplomacy started in 1839 with a quarantine and the challenge of defending health measures in the face of trade and national interest. Doesn't that sound familiar when we think of this year and last year? And this has remained the leitmotif of health diplomacy until today. We need to combine diplomatic and health expertise and experience. They have for a long time not interfaced enough. And that's one of the points which came in the previous panel, that we didn't have that interface enough. By now, we don't have to prove it anymore. This is why, as you mentioned, Ilona, that we launched the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute 13 years ago. And congratulations to you, to the co-authors and the team for the launch of the guide. As the previous panel has showed, we need to go big and go local. Jawad has mentioned the discussion on the global treaty to go big. Suri has mentioned that we need to go local. I want to make one example. We're supporting and working with a global youth mobilization of Generation Disruptive, where the youth organizations around the world will go really local with youth projects that they can take their destiny in their own hand. We have already heard we need to get better in health diplomacy as we go into the future, starting by studying this guide, and we already know need to start now to learn from the pandemic for beyond the pandemic. This is what we want to explore with this panel, and we also start with opening remark by Ambassador Juan José Gómez Camacho. Okay, you can bring back the slide, that's fine. After him, and I also, for the sake of time, will be short with the introduction. Nisia Trinidad Lima is the president of Fiocruz. Tanisha Fasal, professor of political science for the University of Minnesota. Olubukola Adesina, lecturer in Abidjan, in University of Abadan in Nigeria, and Stephanie Seydou, the Ambassador of Global Health of France. So with that, I propose to go to Ambassador Gómez Camacho, and it's such a pleasure to meet you virtually again, as we were negotiating together when you were chairing the negotiation of the pandemic influenza preparedness framework, which was the predecessor of the big issues we are now in. And so I would ask you to speak of the future of equity in global health and what we can learn from those big framework negotiations, from the current COVID vaccine access challenges for equity challenges into the future. Ambassador Gómez Camacho, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Gaudens. It's really a great pleasure to see you again after all these years. And hearing from the work you keep doing. Same goes for Ilona. Really a great pleasure to join forces again. Congratulations, by the way, for this fantastic and very much needed book that you produced. So congratulations to you and to your co-authors. And let me say that it's also a pleasure to share, even if it's the screen, with two old friends like Dr. Tedros and my very dear friend, Dr. Margaret Chan, whom precisely we did the PEEP framework a few years ago, and with Dr. Tedros and Margaret, by the way, in the last phase of her tenure and the beginning of Dr. Tedros in New York, the antimicrobial resistance pledge and mechanism that we launched there a few years ago as well. So thank you so much. Let me make 4 points, if I can, from the practitioner's perspective. what I think those of us that are involved or will be involved in health diplomacy have to keep in mind. First point, let me do it by adding a second half to the title of the book, Global Health Diplomacy. And the other half of that, I think it should say health as foreign policy, health as global governance. If we have learned something over the years, and now we are seeing it again in a very dramatic fashion, is that health is not only about health itself, if I can put it this way. Health means prosperity or the lack of. Health means economic growth or the lack of. Health means wealth or poverty. Health means equality or inequality. In other words, health crisscrosses all the spectrum of human activity, of course, socially, politically, and indeed economically, and for the same reason, all the spectrum of global politics, foreign policy, and global governance. So health diplomacy, as very often people tend to believe, is not a bubble for experts, ministries of health to discuss, to sit together and to address the problems. Is far bigger, wider, and goes across the board. So this is the first point I think we need to keep in mind. So it is not about only working in, it's not a niche, even if dramatic, space of global politics, but rather is everything. That's what first point. The second point is the following. Very often, or all the time rather, diplomats, I'm thinking again as a diplomat, we are always confronted, if you like, or trying to mediate between an apparent dilemma, an apparent tension between what we understand as collective interest on the one hand, and on the other, what we understand or perceive as self-interest. And very often it is true that collective interest and self-interest are not the same. And in multilateral diplomacy and politics, finding a middle ground, if you like, to address this tension and often contradiction is a true art, and that's what we do. But in the case of health, we need to understand, and we have not, that collective interest is, in fact, self-interest. As Secretary General Guterres was saying yesterday in the Security Council, and he has been forcefully repeating, the only way we can address this pandemic, because of globalization and the things that you understand better than me, is by moving all together. We cannot address this country by country. It is self-defeating, not only collectively, individually as a country, if we focus on ourselves instead of focusing in working all together. So for a diplomat to understand that this is, in this case, is not my own interest versus everybody else's interest, but in fact, everybody else's interest is in my best interest. This is the second point that we diplomats need to thoroughly understand. And as evident as now may sound or look, unfortunately, when you are in the rooms of the UN or in the multilateral spaces, you can see that really is not clear enough. Third point, we tend to say and to see ourselves diplomats as bridge builders between countries. And that is true, absolutely true. But increasingly, in many areas, and especially so on health, we have to be also bridge builders between the international system and our own countries internally. Why? For two reasons, very simple, to me very obvious. One, of course, is because whatever we are trying to do outside in the global system to address this phenomena, based on on the two ideas I already mentioned, we need to our leaders need to take corresponding domestic public policies. And that requires enormous challenges. So the role of a diplomat is also being able to connect that with interior. But the second reason, and more complex and very important, is political. Our political leaders, every political leader in the world, elected leader, have an enormous challenge to mediate between the fear of the society, the pressures from the society caused because of the fear and the real dangers of a pandemic, and then this notion of collective interest where we need to work together, we need to share vaccines, etc., etc. It requires enormous leadership, political leadership and skill. And a diplomat needs to help political leaders to connect the two realms and realities. And the last point I would make is that we need also to learn as diplomats that at least health diplomacy, and increasingly others, is about diplomacy amongst shareholders, not only diplomacy amongst states. We always tend to believe that diplomacy is between us countries and the rest of shareholders are observers. No, not in health or not on health. On health is diplomacy amongst shareholders. And we diplomats, or those that are dealing with health, need to learn and to understand much better how to communicate with scientific community, with the medical profession, and very much so with the industry. If we learn something during the PIP negotiations and years later on the AMR negotiations, was that talking to the industry, understanding the industry and pushing and helping the industry to understand the realities and the needs of our countries and societies, health was crucial. And you remember that when we finally succeeded after months of work on the PIP negotiation, and again, the same happened on AMR, was when we managed to be on the same page between industry, civil society, scientists, and governments. This is what is very much needed. So we diplomats need to learn to understand stakeholders. The same way we are, for example, pushing the private sector, corporations everywhere in the world on every sector, telling them you need to move from the notion of shareholders to stakeholders. We need to do exactly the same. We need to stop thinking in terms of shareholders, meaning countries owning the global system, to shareholders, where all the beneficiaries and subjects of the system are also not only taken into account, not only heard, no, they have to be full participants of the process. Yes, decisions will be made by countries. Yes, decisions will be made by political leaders of the system, but the stakeholders have to be part and parcel of the process. If we do not learn to or do not understand these four things that in my view are critical, I really don't think we will be able to fully address these dramatic global challenges like health and many others, by the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Juan Jose, for your wise words. Indeed, a lot of food for thought, which I want to take into the panel discussion. I'll ask for relatively short introductions from the panelists to follow, that we have some time afterwards also for discussion, and would like to start with Nizia Lima, the president of Fiocruz, to speak on health emergency, the future role of science diplomacy in global health. Nizia, please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Dr. Silvia Schmidt, Dr. Tedros, Dr. Shan. A special congratulations to Dr. Ilona Kickbush. It's my pleasure to take part of this panel, especially to launch the guide of global health diplomacy. My first point is that to think about science in health diplomacy, we have to think about that global health diplomacy is global health is in the core of all dimensions of diplomacy, not only because of pandemic, but pandemic reveals this strategic place of global health diplomacy. Well, I think also that to think about science and about the future of societies with so dramatic event as the COVID-19 demands that you look at the present and at the same time as the past decades, because many challenges demand us that you look at this picture. The COVID-19 pandemic reveals the economic, social, and environmental challenges the world faced for the last decades, where the social and economic inequality within and between countries, territories, and population groups has increased. The pandemic also highlights the tension between a vision of global health and nation states and regional blocs' interests. At the center of these tensions are vulnerabilities, such as the lack of health products, such as ventilators, essential medicines, masks, personal protective equipment for health providers, and lately, vaccines. And I agree completely with the idea of vaccine diplomacy, that we are looking at so dramatic dimension of this topic related to vaccines and vaccination and protection of all societies. It also brings to the attention the core relevance of strengthening science, technology, and innovation for a new vision of public health in the knowledge society. It becomes necessary to face the mother of all inequalities, the inequality of knowledge. More symmetrical distribution of productive and innovation capacities is needed to promote national and global response based on universality and equity instead of the growing concentration and monopolization of health. It's crucial to guide economic, productive, and technological global efforts in health from different countries with different development levels towards social and environmental needs. The demands of society, and the sustainability of the planet must guide all public policies and be integrated into the principle that the ultimate meaning of development promotes quality of life and environmental preservation. The fourth technological revolution presents the risk of reproduction of inequalities. However, it also represents an enormous opportunity to place the world of artifacts and technology in the service of the greater goals of society and the planet. The health diplomacy provided by WHO with the support of diplomats has led to a solidarity action in health. The Solidarity Trial Project and the ACT Accelerator, including its pillars such as the COVAX facility, are examples of the significant advancements that the global community can achieve when act together in a solidary way. Understanding the global health ecosystem and the practical tools of health diplomacy will help negotiate other social, economic, and environmental issues essential for public health, including science, technology, innovation, climate change, human rights, immigration, and community resilience. The strengthening of the universal health system based on human rights and primary health care depends on all of those dimensions and is the only way we can be better prepared for the next health crisis and for the future of health and societies. So the role of science in global health diplomacy is a role directly connected to the idea of deal with inequalities and how to go away in a better and solidary way. The international community already has good roadmaps. The 2030 Agenda and its SDGs, and it's important to mention that we are seeing that many of these SDGs can go back and not go ahead as our will. And besides the 2030 Agenda, I would like to mention UN framework for the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19 and UN research roadmap for COVID-19 recovery. A mix of these references interpreted by the Guide for Health Diplomacy will be a milestone to build back a better, socially just, sustainable, and health world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nisia, and the importance of equity and science and the evidence base that we need, which is indeed at the fight that we are fighting also from the side from WHO, sometimes against odds, and that's what we want to explore also as Tanisha Faisal will speak on health diplomacy in the geopolitical reality. Tanisha, over to you.
Thank you very much. So first, let me say that I'm honored to be participating in this event alongside so many distinguished panelists. So thank you very much for having me, and congratulations on the publication of this important new book. So as Gaudens mentioned, my remit today is to discuss the geopolitical side of health diplomacy. And while I think that the attention that health diplomacy has received over the past year is likely here to stay, it's clear also, as we have seen over the past year with mask diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, and vaccine nationalism, issues we've talked about already today, that health diplomacy is also used strategically by states to promote their own political interests. And so what I want to do is to zoom out a bit and describe two historical trends that I observe with respect to health diplomacy. The idea being that we can, by looking backward, maybe it can help us look forward. The first trend that I observe is a potential shift during pandemics away from global multilateral health diplomacy conducted via international governmental organizations like the WHO and toward bilateral and perhaps regional health diplomacy. And I think, unfortunately, we observe this trend most clearly in some of the most challenging global health emergencies. I see this to some extent in the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, where you had UNMIR, the United Nations Mission for Emergency Ebola Response, playing an important role, of course, but you also had really high visibility for US, British, and Chinese contributions. And of course, today, with respect to COVID-19, when we've seen these terms like mask diplomacy, which is sometimes used in a derogatory sense, become much more common, and the WHO has been on the receiving end of a great deal of criticism. But I think if we think about this longer potential trend in health diplomacy, the challenges that have been faced by the WHO and global health diplomacy during the COVID-19 pandemic are in some sense not all that surprising. States seem to lean less on global institutions like the WHO during more challenging global health emergencies. I do think that another possible trend that we may be observing is regionally based health coalitions, as was underlined especially in the previous panel, that operate somewhere between the bilateral and global institutional space. The second set of data that I want to talk about speaks to health diplomacy more broadly, not just in the context of pandemics. And here I do think that health diplomacy has become a forum for great power competition. So I've been looking, for example, at US and Chinese health aid. And if you map US and Chinese health aid since 2000, there is an argument to be made that the United States is kind of chasing China around the world. China has famously made a number of investments in sub-Saharan Africa, especially on the health front, but it has since shifted its efforts to Latin America, while the US is more focused on sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm curious to see what's going to happen next in terms of the geographic location of the US of the United States health investments. And I should mention that many of these health aid projects are funded, at least in some part, by the US or Chinese militaries. And there are, of course, a lot of questions around the form of the investments that are made, especially who benefits, whether there are strings attached. But the broader point here is that there are multiple tracks of health diplomacy, and one of those tracks may be more cooperative, more competitive than cooperative. And so let me just end by raising this question that I think is really prompted by the data, which is, what's good and what's bad about this. And I would, of course, like everyone else, want to approach this question from a global equity perspective. And we, of course, don't know the answer yet. It's possible that competition around health diplomacy could generate some positive externalities for the world's most vulnerable people. You could make the argument that more competition could lead to better health outcomes. I'm skeptical of that argument. I think it's also likely to produce inefficiencies, especially if there's duplication or poor allocation that could have been better managed through multilateral institutions. And I want to mention also that there's another kind of actor that we haven't really discussed much today, wealthy private foundations like the Gates Foundation, that are going to be part of reshaping global health diplomacy. But I think it's really critical to acknowledge these various state and non-state actor incentives and interests in order to advance the agenda of addressing inequities in global health. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tanisha. To show those interfaces where we play between diplomacy, science, geopolitics, and moving on then to Olubukola Adesina on the future of digital diplomacy, just to remind us that with the start of the World Health Assembly was the first global assembly being fully digital. So that's another reality that we have to cope with, and also how do we negotiate in that remote age. Olubukola, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you can see me and hear me. All right, thank you. Well, I had some internet issues and I'm just in at the right time. All right, one of the problems of digital diplomacy, I'm supposed to talk about the future of digital diplomacy, is what I just experienced. I've been in since 4 o'clock, but now it just threw me out and I've had difficulty getting back in, but now I'm in. So when we talk about digital diplomacy, we're talking about the use of digital technology and digital tools of communication, especially social media platforms in support of diplomatic objectives. We see a lot of that recently with a lot of activities going on social media. and a lot of traffic on social media networks. So we see that countries must not let that opportunity pass them by. So countries have to utilize social media, especially in projecting their positions to the international audience. So when we talk about digital diplomacy, well, you can talk about the use of electronic media, for example, podcasts, blogs, websites, and so on, where international audience can be able to see what countries have in place and what they want to share with the international audience. And we see, as I say, we have a lot of that going on. And also the use of social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, for example. You see a lot of activities going on Facebook, a lot of activities on Twitter. You see a lot of tweets and a lot of leaders, heads of states, utilizing Twitter and utilizing Facebook to be able to communicate with the international audience. So historically, we see that diplomacy was cautious, involves meetings conducted behind closed doors, but we see that a lot of that has to change with activities moved online. Now, governments now have to discuss policies on new platforms, discuss with new people, and it gives back to new networks. So we see a lot of networking on social media with new groupings of people, and so on and so forth. So we see that digital diplomacy now goes, diplomacy goes beyond government to government business now. We now see that a lot of activities of governments have moved to the purview of civil society and the public in general. So governments now have to utilize this medium, these platforms to be able to communicate what they have to do. And you have new channels of communication, new channels of choice, and they have to see which audience fit into whatever it is that they want to put across. So in particular, we see that the global spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and the various health measures put in place brought about a challenge with the traditional mode of diplomacy. So the practice of meeting face-to-face, shaking hands, and carrying out in-person diplomatic functions have been replaced by virtual video conferences. You have a lot of multilateral meetings now being carried out online. And we see that these conferences, of course, with traditional diplomacy, we have a lot of negotiations that will go on, especially when we have breaks and the likes. But now we hear of virtual tea breaks, so which has is more or less a challenge to the normal negotiations that may go on behind the scene. But whether we like it or not, we still have to talk about the future of digital diplomacy. I say, is there a future for digital diplomacy? I'll say a big yes. We see that digital diplomacy is here to stay. As I said, a lot of meetings are going on online, and we see that it actually cut out a lot of travel times, and even the risk of whatever it is, having to travel and so on. All those activities are being carried on online. We see that a lot of these activities have to be moderated by social media practitioners, for example, in putting across the right information to the right audience, getting to know the right audience for each of the platforms, and also getting to know what the right things to do at the right time, and not to miss the opportunity for negotiations that are possible online. However, even this, as we say that there's a future for digital diplomacy, we see that there are a lot of risks and challenges that go with digital diplomacy. For instance, we talk about security of online platforms. A lot of we have to deal with cybersecurity. We see that a lot of hackings and so on are going on, that things must be done to be able to ensure that you have effective management of these platforms or information that you put across on the social media. So a major challenge to digital diplomacy that I would say is the digital divide. A lot of things make it difficult for effective participation online. We see challenges with low broadband with unstable network internet connection. And also we have high data charges. For example, in Africa, a lot of the opportunities provided by the use of social media platforms for digital diplomacy, we see that many African countries are unable to utilize them because of mostly the digital divide, low broadband width, as I said, infrastructure not being in place, and also being able to manage information online. We have a lot of disinformation and so on and so forth. So diplomats and governments and those who utilize social media platforms for putting across information and getting across to the right audience must be able to put in strategies that will be simple and clear, and also be able to facilitate what they want to get across. And they must realize that the message on social media cannot always be controlled. Sometimes, for example, some people tweet and delete, but it takes a second for a message to get across. You post something in a minute and you come back to delete because you think, no, this is false information. But so many people already read, and you have so many shares and likes and dislikes and so on, and tweet and retweeting and tweet and retweeting, and which can cause a lot of problems in the international community. But as I said, digital diplomacy is here to stay. Government will have to key in and see how they can make the best of the opportunities being provided by the use of digital technologies and social media in being able to get across to the audience and the public. And also another point I would like to make is that there's a lot that the government and diplomats can use digital diplomacy to achieve. For instance, in Africa, we have a lot of conspiracy theories on the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people do not believe that COVID-19 is real. So we have a lot of spreading of the virus because people are not following the COVID-19 protocols and so on and so forth.
Can you please conclude?
Okay, so in closing, I'll say that there's a future for digital diplomacy. I'll say that governments have to use the social media platforms in a way that will best showcase project the countries utilizing these platforms. Thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Olubukola. Also to showcase the equity link of digital diplomacy and the science and the evidence-based link. We experienced that a lot. We have been working with Google, with Twitter, with Facebook to get the right information up. And I want to come back to another point that Juan Jose has been mentioning of that international national interface of that diplomats need to be managing. And Ambassador Stephanie Seydoux, you remember well my time in your function. I was on in Switzerland, where as much as the international negotiation is coordinating back at home. Could you elaborate on that national coordination role of a global health ambassador for today and for tomorrow as we move forward? Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this great opportunity, and lovely to find so many great colleagues and friends around the table. And also let me use this opportunity to say that I've had a quick look at the book, the guide on diplomacy and health. It's great, and I can confess that I learned quite a few things reading it. I'd love to have a chance to keep discussing it, because of course some of the points I would love to possibly challenge a little bit, but I thought it was very rich, very thoughtful, gave great keys to understanding the whole balance of this global diplomacy concept, particularly as it is completely up to date with the very latest, the COVID outbreak and all its game-changing consequences. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to say that I'm going to be quite short because I'll welcome questions, but can I say that what I do, and that is the job in France at least, is I have a slight coordinating role between mainly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Health. I have a couple of great people working with me, but I don't head a department as such. And part of what I do is actually ensuring that information gets across and that it's passed on to other people. I work very closely, but in articulation with my colleague, François Rivasseau, who you might all know, the permanent representative in Geneva. Of course, our roles are do not overlap, and we're careful about that. So negotiation is definitely in his mandate, not mine. So what do I do at home? Some of it is super straightforward, and I could very happily write it in in the health diplomacy guide, feeling extremely comfortable with all of it, and and some of it is actually a lot more informal. So the mandate is very clear. Part of it is actually to represent France on the boards of two important multilateral health organizations. One of them is the Global Fund Against HIV, TB, and Malaria, who I'm sure you all know, and the other one is UNITAID. As you can see, both of those organizations are non-UN organizations, although UNITAID is part of WHO, which is, of course, itself a UN organization. And this came about this was organized as such in the years 2000, when those organizations, new and very novel at the time, were created. Also, my role is to contribute to also implementing a global health strategy which France has, which is in line with a vision which I feel very comfortable with, and especially having heard all the distinguished speakers on this panel and the previous one, which is to actually advocate for, indeed, a multilateral approach to health, and to defending such positions as promoting the SDGs, promoting articulation between the SDGs beyond, naturally, SDG 3, which is the health objective, and all of this within the international fora in which I represent France in the seat, but also in other interventions. And the strategy which I was alluding to of France has three main points. One is to promote access to universal health coverage and fighting diseases while strengthening health systems. The second point and priority is to defend the rights of populations, so a people-centered approach with an attention to human rights and gender and key populations. And the third priority is to promote health security. And that strategy was in place in 2017, goes through to 2022. And so that predated somehow the COVID. So this is all very straightforward, and one can feel extremely comfortable in that role. And let me say that with the onslaught of the pandemic, well, those fundamentals didn't change. I mean, France was still going to be about promoting a multilateral approach to the crisis with an attention to populations, to strengthening health systems. And in the ACT-A initiative, which was mentioned earlier, this is definitely the position which our president took. And it wasn't necessarily the majority or the dominant vision when international efforts started emerging to try and give a coordinated response to the COVID crisis. And I have to say that this was definitely what France defended. So this is, I would say, the part which is quite easy and straightforward in principle, at least. Not saying that there is achievement on every single one of these objectives, but there's a fairly logical attribution of financial means and human resource in line with those through our bilateral cooperation agencies, as well as fairly consequent contributions to multilateral health organizations. And then there's the other part, which isn't written really anywhere, and which makes the job fascinating, very important, very interesting, and which is also not as overboard, let's say. And that is actually being a diplomat, let's say, or an advocate for health, for global health within the national system. And a lot of what I do, I guess, daily is indeed to ensure that information goes around, but also, when I said coordinate between different areas of government, and also with the very many stakeholders which make up in a sense, the broad French constituency, and that they are all the the diverse actors which are mentioned throughout this panel: civil society, foundations, private sector, research, and others, and also public opinion relays, the press to some extent, etc. Well, there can be a need to actually put forward the need to focus on particular stakes, bring forward the beyond the words and sometimes the positions which can be expressed here or there, what this would mean in reality, and trying to raise attention, awareness, and interest internally, which does not always happen. And as I guess has been the case with many people, in some ways, COVID has actually, of course, been this very unfortunate but extremely powerful push to put health at the top of the political agenda. And I know that what we're dealing with now is to try and indeed not have a controversy or contradiction between what is being stated up front in terms of going the multilateral way and what is the reality of diverse countries' interests. But if we go back to what Michel Kazachkin was saying earlier, which is to push health at the right level of global political attention, well, I mean, this was done mechanically by this crisis. And so I guess the challenges we're going to have now is to keep it up there, keep it with the same level of attention to be given to a notion such as global public good, equity, people-centered approaches. And I want to finish with just one point, which I believe is
very short, please.
Key is the financing. How do we turn this health agenda into an investment case? Health is an investment. This is absolutely necessary in order to reconcile everyone with globalization. Health as an investment, I suppose, would be a great outcome of this crisis for health diplomacy.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. And just one thing I discovered when I switched from that national to that WHO role was that the policy coherence within WHO is at least as complex as within a government. So that's a common challenge, and we need that coherence. As time is running, I would just ask Juan Jose for a final word from his side on, when you look at what we are learning, what is the one lesson you want us for the future beyond the pandemic to take forward? A short word from you before we hand back to Ilona for the final word.
Thank you, Gaudens, and thank you to all, because it's extremely interested what they said, and I couldn't agree more with all of you. I would just focus on what I was saying before. Again, countries need to understand that it is in our best self-owned interest to work with the others. And that's what diplomat needs to understand. Very often we diplomats, I'm very self-critical, we simply don't understand it. And second point, and to conclude, is that solidarity is very important, is intrinsic in what we do in the multilateral diplomacy, very much so in the case of health. However, I wouldn't focus too much on the notion of solidarity, simply because it can be misunderstood. It can be misunderstood as we need to help because we are nice. We need to help because we are charitable. We are richer, we need to help the poor. Fair enough, that's important. But in the case of health, it's not about only solidarity. It is, again, about that if we want to address the problems that we are facing, we need to help the others. Prosperity in general, health in particular, can only be built together, cannot be built in isolation. The world has changed and we need to understand it.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all panelists. I would love to continue 1 more hour of discussion, but Ilona, I think that's not the intention. So thanks a lot, and back to you, Ilona.
Thank you very much, Gaudens, and thank you so much to the participants of the panel. It's always short if one can only organize 1 hour, but I think your key messages have clearly come across, this interaction between the global and the national, the new geopolitical dimension that has come in, that Tanisha has added, the very, very high importance of science now also in relation to diplomacy and knowledge as a global public good, because that's in the end what intellectual property is about. And of course, the way the digital is changing everything we do as it is right now. But I think with everyone, the 4 messages of the ambassador will stick very closely. And some of the messages we heard earlier on this afternoon, that if we don't understand and don't realize as people, as countries, as those share and stakeholders, as he said, that this is about all of us. That, at one stage in diplomacy, we spoke about enlightened self-interest. I think it's moved beyond that. It is really, unless we all work together, we will not survive. And as some of you have said, in this case, it's about the pandemic. In other cases, it's about the environment. In other cases, it's about our economic models. This issue has also been raised. And therefore, there's a tremendous amount of work to do for diplomats in general, health diplomats in particular. But I think what the message of this panel was, and it was already there in the previous panel, the mindset has to change if we want to move forward and really practice global health diplomacy in a new way. So we will surely come back to all of you. Our guide is not set in stone. Stephanie, we'd love to hear and discuss with you those issues where you have different views. We decided we were not a multilateral organization writing the guide, but for people with an opinion. And that's what we decided to do. So I hope you also come back to us with any criticisms or different views. So thank you very much to this panel. Thank you very much to the panel before. Please use the guide. Please send us your comments. Give us ideas if you want to translate the guide. That I'm sure would be helpful to many more people around the world. And please remember, the Global Health Center does many, many interesting things. You can find upcoming events on the website. Please make use of it. And obviously, as all centers and institutions have today, is a mailing list if you want to hear regularly about what's going to happen. We will definitely continue to look at global health diplomacy in a variety of ways, and we'll keep you up to date. One of the things we'll be doing is collecting more case studies. We put 2 of them in the guide. We will be collecting more of them, and we will be developing some guidelines how one could do training courses in relation to the rich material that is in the guide. So more to come from our side, and again, please use the guide in whatever way you think helpful and give us feedback. Thank you very much to all of those that have stuck with us listening, and to all of those that have contributed actively. Goodbye, and have a nice day, afternoon, or evening.